All right, I think we are good to get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, this morning or afternoon, wherever you're logging in from. Joining me today is Gretchen Geigen, our Member Experience Manager. And my name is David Meller, Director of Policy here at the Center for Open Science. Today, we're going to be talking about using OSF to meet upcoming policy requirements and expectations, and to talk about how the Transparency and Openness Promotion Guidelines, the updates to that, TOP 2025, are a useful framework for helping to meet those upcoming expectations. Yesterday, we had a webinar all about the TOP guidelines and the revision process and what that means. If you're interested in learning more about what that specific policy is, the recording for that should be up on our YouTube channel today or tomorrow, likely. And this webinar is going to be recorded as well. I'll give an introduction to what the TOP guidelines are, but again, if you want more detailed about all of the different policies and practices covered there, that information is available. So let me give a brief overview of what we'll be talking about, and then I'll get into the meat of everything. So I'm going to start with a little bit about the Center for Open Science, who we are and what our mission is and how we work to achieve that. I'll be pointing out some of the upcoming policy guidance and how the definitions of open data are specifically crafted and what the implications of that are. I'll also be talking about other policy changes that are upcoming, given a lot of uncertainty about what U.S. federal guidance will look like over the next several years. By the crystal ball, there would be different things happening. Next, I'll be talking, I'll give a brief overview of what that policy framework is, the Transparency and Openness Promotion Guidelines, and how to use it in these settings. And then I'll be passing the baton to Gretchen and specifically talking about using OSF in university settings with these issues in mind. And we should have plenty of time at the end for a Q&A session. So feel free to use the chat and/or the Q&A widget, and we'll make sure to answer as many of those as possible. And our slides are available. I'll post a link to those slides at the end as well. So feel free to use those. I'd like to start off with just a recognition of our financial supporters. So we are generously supported by both private and government research grants. And the work that is supported by COS would not be possible without those supporters, and more information about those finances are available on our website. So the Center for Open Science, our mission is to increase transparency and openness and integrity, and for the purposes of increasing reproducibility of scientific research. And we work to achieve that mission through a comprehensive theory of change that is illustrated nicely, but by what we call the pyramid of change. And essentially, it comes down to thinking about if you want to promote new practices, a lot of the things that we talk about in open science in terms of replication, data sharing, study registration, or what have you, a lot of those will be taken up as long as they are possible for anybody to do. Or rather, it won't be taken up at a large scale, but the earliest adopters will be able to do so the moment it becomes possible. Then it becomes a matter of making it as easy and as normalized as possible by improving user experience and by showcasing and discussing with peers what those practices are and what they look like and what the standards and norms should look like. A lot of that base of that pyramid really accounts for a large majority of adoption of new practices. Finally, it's often necessary to address and create specific incentives for the types of behaviors you want to see. And only then, once the norms are established and there are good ways to do it, and lots of people are doing it. Does formalizing those new practices with policy change become necessary? But many of these practices have been actively discussed and encouraged and tried for a decade or more now, and so we are at the point where big scale policy changes are occurring. And the purpose of this webinar is to help prepare a larger audience for those. Today, we'll be focusing on these two main aspects of the theory of change. So 2 years ago now, the Office of Science and Technology Policy issued guidance on open access to research publications, but also open access to research data. And this is going to apply to all research that's conducted by federally supported grants or by science that is conducted by government researchers. Important distinctions from current regulations are that there will be no embargo period for these for compliance with these expectations, and the inclusion of open data into this policy framework is another big change, and that will be most of the focus of what we'll be talking about. In particular, the Nelson Memo describes scientific data as being under the purview of what each federal agency should be focusing on in crafting their open science requirements. And the definition of what they mean by open data is very specific and has a lot of implications. And it's also broader than prior definitions in federal policy guidance. So the specific language that we focus in on is that data is the recorded factual material commonly accepted by scientists as of sufficient quality to validate and replicate research findings. And importantly, the word replicate was added in addition to what prior definitions included. So the materials needed to validate and replicate research findings. It doesn't include lab books. It doesn't include peer reviews or preliminary analyses or things like that. But it does include all the materials needed, again, to validate and then replicate what's being disseminated through papers. As I mentioned, we don't know what the federal landscape is going to look like in the near term, but the spirit behind that definition is being fairly widely adopted by private funders and by international organizations, international governments. So the movement towards open science in the EU, private funders, the Open Research Funders Group is a large consortium of funders that are working towards similar purposes and similar goals. Likewise, the Health Research Alliance has working groups on open science, standardizing open science policies across a large number of private research foundations. Again, all of these will vary as they are individual entities, but the general movement is similar to what I was describing in the past several slides. So what does that mean? Recorded factual material needed to validate and replicate research findings. We point to several on our platform. We specifically point to digital materials, questionnaires, code books needed to conduct the work, analytic code needed to analyze the data, the raw or cleaned data needed that's collected during the process, along with metadata and descriptors to really describe what those values are, and a declaration that the study is going to take place, most importantly with a protocol attached to it to help describe the individual recipe, the step-by-step process under which the procedures were conducted. These are all taken into consideration during the revision of the top guidelines, which I'm going to talk about right now. The Transparency and Openness Promotion Guidelines were first published in 2015, and over the past 2 years, we've been working with stakeholders and developing revisions to the framework. I won't go into details about what they used to be, what the changes are, and what the process was. All of this is going to be focused on what they are right now. But again, more details about what that process was given in yesterday's webinar, which will be available on our website shortly. The top guidelines framework consists of 7 research practices and a variety of verification practices, along with specific study types used for verification, all of which are created for the purposes of increasing the ability to verify an empirical research claim. The top doesn't change everything in science, or doesn't try to change everything in the scientific community or improve the conduct of science in every possible way. But it does specifically look to enhance the ability for somebody to verify what is being claimed in a paper. The conceptual framework that underlies the rationale for all of these is briefly summarized here. So those 3 different categories of items: research practices, verification practices, and verification studies, all independently work towards that goal, that objective of increasing someone's ability to verify a claim. Verification practices and studies are things I love to talk about, but they are also a little bit out of scope of the purposes of today's session. What I'll be focusing on mostly are these research practices. These are individual practices that a researcher can, and I'd say in many cases should, undertake in order to help reach that objective of increasing verifiability. And they are specifically designed to help meet that point that I was making a few minutes ago of containing items that are designed to help increase the replicability, the ability to substantiate and replicate research findings. So these 7 research practices are what I'll focus on over the next few minutes. One of the purposes of the top guidelines is to help policymakers, namely publishers and funders, describe different ways that these policies can be implemented. So each of those 7 research practices can be adopted or used in different ways independently from one policymaker to another entity. We encourage all policymakers, journals, funders, publishers at large, to help standardize the disclosure stating whether or not these practices are taking place by an individual scholar. And as norms evolve or as practices become more useful in a specific community, it might become time to require that individual research practice be conducted. And so that would be a level 2 policy, where it's required that the author share and cite the item that's being conducted, so the data set that's being created or the analytic code that was developed to analyze the data. The hardest level to adopt, takes most time and effort and money and expertise, is that certification level 3, somebody checking to make sure that it was done to an appropriate standard. That is an overview of the framework that the top guidelines provides. It's a little bit more than, again, what's needed for the purposes of this webinar. What we'll be doing next is simply talking about each of these 7 different practices, what they are, what they mean, and then Gretchen will be talking about how they can be implemented, how they can be conducted on the OSF. So the first is study registration. This is an assertion, a declaration that a study is going to be conducted, and it's being submitted to a public registry. The OSF, of course, contains a public registry. The largest one, clinicaltrials.gov, was created over 20 years ago in order to help everybody, patients in particular, understand how many drug trials are being undertaken at any given time. But its benefits to the wider scientific community helps us understand how many total studies are being conducted. And as study registration uh, takes off from just the clinical research world to uh, preclinical and to more and more empirical research studies, it becomes more and more useful as scholars are able to see what's ongoing research. It helps understand how big the file drawer might be for how much research is being conducted. Each declaration will usually, it should contain enough information to differentiate any given study from any other given study. So it'll contain basic information about the research questions, the population where the data is being collected from, some basic information about the study design. And there can be more information added to it, which I'll get to in the next 2 points. So the second practice is our study protocols. These are those step-by-step instructions that would be necessary for somebody else to conduct that study. A single protocol could be used multiple times. So use the same protocol in experiment 1, experiment 2, experiment 3. Those would be replicates or replications. They could be used by the same lab or a different lab. Again, this is essential information for being able to validate and replicate a study. And changes to protocols occur all the time, and it's common practice to articulate in the final paper any deviations from the originally proposed protocol. The next item, I think around 3, are analysis plans. This is a description of how the research questions will specifically be answered, or more precisely, if it's hypothesis testing research, how those worded hypotheses will be translated to a very specific statistical test. An analysis plan will include information like the sample size, the variables that are being conducted, the predictors, the outcomes, and any control variables. And most importantly, it'll include that statistical model that's being used for each hypothesis. These analysis plans are often, but not always, included in a study registration. And if they're drafted ahead of time before the data is collected, it can be extremely useful in preventing poor statistical practices, namely things such as p-hacking or massaging a data analysis to get a desired result intentionally or unintentionally. So they're useful in those regards. Next are materials, and this is a pretty big grab bag of items. In the social sciences, they'll include things like questionnaires or visual stimuli. In the life sciences, they'll often include antibodies, cell lines, and things like that. In field research, anything that's taken out into the field. Those items that are physical materials that can't be posted to a trusted online repository, of course, need to be precisely identified and described so that somebody else could find them or purchase them or go to a authenticated cell line repository and obtain them themselves. Those that were included in the study as digital materials, again, need to be precisely identified with a digital object identifier, ideally. Or if they're commercial items and the researcher doesn't have permission to just post it freely online, again, they need to precisely describe and identify the measure that was used. Finally, even after all of this, we've been talking about the data sharing mandates, and only now do actually get to something that has the data in it. And this is, of course, those values that are collected or that were accessed as part of the study. Especially for scholarship that includes existing data sets, it becomes a matter of precisely describing where the data were accessed. And it's not just a matter of saying it came from this large collection of agency data. It needs to precisely describe the steps that were used to clean the data in order to use the specific data that were used in the reported research. I probably don't need to beat this drum too much for an audience that probably knows a lot about metadata, but it's of course important to include descriptors of those data sets. So a descriptor identifying a variable as x sub 2 is not useful to anybody, even your future self a week or two from now. It needs to sort of define what those variables are, what the acceptable values of those variables are, and how they were collected. Getting towards the end here, the analytic code are the things like R scripts or Python scripts, or there are many other languages, of course, that was used to analyze that data. Sometimes the analytic code was developed as part of that pre-analysis plan. That's the best case scenario. Most people don't do that because it's hard to code, of course, and it takes a lot of tinkering and minor revisions and troubleshooting. But once it's finalized, posting it along with everything else we've talked about is the expectation with this policy. And last but not least are the use of reporting guidelines. These are checklists that are used to make sure that all of the essential details have been included in the final manuscript. It's very easy. Far more often than not, there aren't enough details about sample size or study design or data exclusion rules, or whatever, do not end up making it into the final manuscript. And these reporting checklists can help remind individuals to include that information. And they tend to be specific to the discipline for which they were created. So Consort, the Prisma guidelines, the Arrive guidelines, these are all specific to different methods or disciplines. Sometimes they're created by publishers for their journals. Those are the STAR methods for Cell Press. The American Psychological Association has journal reporting standards for both quantitative and qualitative fields. So there are many of those available, again, through publishers, through societies, and I believe the largest collection of them is curated on the Equator Network. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to my colleague Gretchen, and I'll be controlling the slides.
Okay.
Gretchen talks.
Okay, all right. Well, hi. As David said, my name is Gretchen Gigan. I work here at the Center for Open Science. I am myself a librarian, and I work here at COS on OSF with our institutional members, many of whom come from libraries, to work with us as partners. So I'm going to talk about TOP 2025 in the context of the library and using OSF. And so I'm going to kind of orient this around consultation and instruction. And infrastructure. So some of the things that as librarians, data management, the support, even if it's not in the library, these are the kinds of things we work on. So to start with, in terms of consultation and outreach, we want to stress that we don't think that TOP is the only guideline you should ever look at or the only checklist, but it can be a helpful rubric if you are working with researchers to help them assess the transparency of research practices. If they come to you and know that they have a mandate that they need to provide material to validate and replicate research findings, TOP can be a good guideline for figuring out what that means and what types of materials they need to deposit or manage or create, although hopefully they've been creating them along the whole process. And they may come to you at the end, but hopefully if you can have an earlier intervention with them, you can help them to develop these things in a way that makes them open and shareable, which is really part of our job. As David talked about as well, each of the practices can be considered in terms of whether they apply and how they have been done. But you can also look at how the researcher wants to meet that expectation. Are they just going to disclose that has been done, or are they able to openly share it? And where are they sharing it? And is the place that they're sharing it a trusted repository with a link that won't degrade, etc. And finally, you might also be looking at You might also be helping the researcher look at their mandates or their publishing policies to see which of these practices are recommended or required and to what level. So we don't have lots of, we haven't created materials around TOP to directly address consultation and outreach, but we would love to have that as part of the way that it gets used in institutions, and would love to work with folks who may be interested in developing those kinds of materials. But if you go to the next slide, what I'm primarily going to talk about is using OSF for the infrastructure for various TOP practices. So you may have infrastructure that you have locally, institutional repositories, data repositories. OSF can play a role in filling in some of the gaps that those repositories that you may already offer as infrastructure don't fit the bill for these kinds of practices. If you go to the next slide, OSF, oh, go back one, please. Okay, thanks. So OSF is a platform that's really organized around three, I think of them as objects, other people refer to them as workflows, but there are three major ways you can interact with OSF and create and share material. Within OSF, the database behind it, the searchable database behind it, metadata in OSF is created around these three things, which are basically aggregates of materials. So it's not like each individual file, it's really centered around the kind of aggregation of things at particular levels. And that's actually really helpful for what we want to do to meet these different research practices. The other thing about these workflows is that it follows the research lifecycle. So early on, you create a registration. As you're carrying out your project, you can use OSF projects. And when you're finished with your work, you can disseminate findings through our preprint services. So I'm going to go through those one at a time and talk about how TOP practices fit into those paradigms. So if we go to the next slide, as David talked about, a registration is really useful for certifying what you're going to do in a project before you get to the point of data analysis. You can also use it to confirm the status of projects at different points in the process. As results, as you're working through the process, you can use the registration as kind of a touch point to document the progress as it goes along. If you go to the next slide. In OSF, adding a new registration involves choosing a template first. And we have templates that are geared towards specific types of studies and practices. And we also have open-ended registrations for things that maybe don't fit exactly into one of those categories. And then the next, if you hit next, the rest of the process is basically filling in a web form. It's actually technically a simple process. You can upload content to accompany this. So if you already have plans written out, or you have instruments, or you have data that you're using from something else, you can include those here. But basically, you go through this web form and it prompts you with questions about what the study is going to do and how you are going to do it. And then when you submit, you get a web page that displays all of that content, all of that information that you shared about the process. Now, the reason it's transparent, and the reason that we say this is different than like just publishing this as a PDF or a web page, is that if you want to come back and make changes or update the registration, if something has changed in the way that you're going to carry out your project, you have to formally submit an update to it that is logged, so you can see exactly what changed. You have a log of when that change occurred, and you can still review the past version. So it's a totally transparent process. You're not hiding any tweaks that you're making along the way. If you go to the next, and in OSF, we also, let me get to my notes. We also have a process of awarding badges for sharing out some specific outputs of the research once it's conducted. So some of these do conform to TOP practices. If you go to the next slide, you can see there's data, there's code, there's materials. And the OSF itself, OSF projects, which I'll talk about next, may be a really great place to actually put that to then share it out through the registration. And the badges provide just the evidence of transparency in that process. Okay, so the most popular feature of OSF is OSF projects. OSF project spaces are a place to store and share materials. They are collaborative. You can have many contributors all working in the same space in OSF, and it helps to centralize all of the parts, all of the materials that are associated with a project in one place and provide context for them. So in OSF, the use of components, which are basically sub-projects, is a key way of organizing materials, and metadata can be created about these components that can help with that dissemination, organization, and transparency. So if we take a look next at organization and metadata in OSF, each OSF project, component, and file can have its own metadata. So in this project, I can see, first of all, that there are two named components. So there they are. One is a final report and one is the data. So they have used two of the top practices in this, and they've organized this into subcomponents. So you can very easily just look at it and you can affirm and you can see, and if you're looking for the data, you know exactly where to go for it. If you go forward, the metadata at the project level, one more, this is related to the project overall, and you can see here that there is a resource type called collection. In this case, the creator chose the term collection from a simplified controlled vocabulary list because a collection is an aggregation of materials, and that's really the term from that list that makes the most sense. These terms then are used in the OSF search for filtering and indexing. So that also helps in the discovery process of being able to pinpoint exactly the types of outputs that someone's looking for. If we go forward and look at the just the data, if I'm looking for just the data, if I go into the data component, again, in the metadata, I can see that the resource type of dataset has been chosen. So OSF, in using these components, provides not just a way to organize these materials into different places to, make it obvious what's going on, but there's also a typology, a controlled vocabulary that you can use to label them in a consistent way across all projects, making it easier, of course, to filter and find and declare what it is that's happening. This shows the metadata at the project and component level, but if you go forward one slide, I also have example of metadata at the file level. So you can get even more precise in this way. If you don't have to create a whole component for materials, if you just have single files, you can call those single files what they are. So this one has been labeled as an instrument. So on OSF, we do have some recommendations for those terms that you might use at each of these levels. Those are in the right-hand column. So you can see they match. This is in the generic what those practices actually include. This helps for that categorization. These conform to DataCite's standards for metadata. So if you do end up creating a DOI, which you can do in OSF for each of these subcomponents or projects, then when we send that metadata to DataCite, it already conforms to the way that they describe and share these materials. Again, making it even more findable downstream because DataCite will share the metadata for these projects in DataCite Commons. It can get picked up by Google and other indexes. You can, of course, though, use other terms that might be more discipline specific or colloquially used in titles, in descriptions, and there are open keywords that can be used in project and components. So you can use a mix of both the controlled vocabulary and the open description to really get the right level of description, for lack of a better word. Finally, if we move forward, OSF also offers preprint services. So I'm sure everyone knows what preprints are and the purpose of them, to share, manuscripts without the formal peer review process, to disseminate things that are being peer reviewed more openly and earlier in the process. But OSF operates an open preprint service for any kind of preprint in any discipline. We also offer a number of community moderated discipline-specific preprint services. And the neatest thing about OSF, if you move forward, this is the last slide that has a bunch of animations. I think the best part of OSF is that all of the outputs from a project can be tied together. So if you create a registration, it can link to a project space. The project space can link back to the registration. It can also link to a preprint. And the preprint itself can be linked back to the registration and again to the project. So you have this kind of nested view of all of the parts of that research practice. And if you go forward, go ahead. You've anticipated me. We'd encourage you to take a look at the OSF very large collection of online support guides and tutorials. We have lots of guides that correspond to specific parts of the practices that David went through. We also have, in some cases, integrations with specific tools that support specific kinds of workflows. So in the middle there, you can see our guide about using protocols.io and connecting OSF to that tool, which is specifically created for the workflow of documenting protocols. So we'd encourage you to look through them or to share them with your researchers who may not know exactly how to interpret some of these parts of the framework. And that is the end of my portion. I think we now have time for questions if anyone has them, or comments.
Thank you very much, Gretchen. I'm going to put in a link to the slides here in the chat. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, so the Q&A tool is there if you want to write a question. You can also put a question in the chat if that's easier. You may not have the option to raise your hand, but or you may, and you can try that as well. And if we don't have any questions, I'm sure we can give you back some time in your day. That's also fine. David, you raise your hand.
Just checking where that works. What's your favorite help guide?
My favorite help guide? I think I created actually a whole suite of help guides specifically for our institutional members who are primarily librarians and research support staff. And we have a couple of pages in there that link to all kinds of materials about how to use OSF, how to teach OSF, how to promote OSF. And then we have another page that's really kind of cool, which is a huge list of training materials, event plans, templates for OSF projects. And those were all actually in OSF itself. So if you go to our help guides and you look for the member support documents and then go to institutions, you will find them there. It's kind of in a little bit of a side alley, which I'm sure librarians are used to, finding the stuff that's geared directly to us as helpers rather than end users, but there are some useful things there.
We have a question here. I'm going to how can OSF for institutions, so that specific interface for institutional members, how can that be used to help institutions with outreach and compliance relating to
Great. So
these issues?
Yeah, happy to answer that. So OSF Institutions is a program, if anyone is interested in that for your institution, doesn't have to be a university. We work with research labs, we work with government agencies, any kind of organization. What we can do is work with you to integrate an authentication process with whatever you use at your university. It can be an actual SSO, or it can just be based on email if you're a small organization. And then when users use OSF and are affiliated, that affiliation gets added to their content that they create. So the name, when it's viewed in a web page, branding that you choose, and in the metadata, a persistent identifier called a ROR identifier is added to material. And what that means is that you can then have a single place where you can check on material that has been created by your institution. So I will share here. This is just an example from one of our institutional members, Harvard. You can come here and you can see the projects that Harvard researchers are creating, the registrations that as a community they're working on. If you are working with on data curation, or if you are in looking at who on your campus is working on projects, who you need to reach out to, who you would like to work with, or who is already a champion for open science because they're already using OSF, you can come in here and see the kinds of work that they're working on. You can identify data sets in particular, or papers, etc. And then once you are part of the network, that's the main kind of technical component. But then we also, in addition to that, offer, as members, support the ability to do demonstrations at your institution, a discount on open science training that we offer through the Center for Open Science. We have member events and webinars for community discussion or sharing best practices. I'm trying to think, what else do we have? The support guidelines, like I just mentioned. Oh, and then your users, if they write into the OSF help desk, they're identified as a priority ticket to respond to. So your users should get a response as soon as possible from the OSF staff that manage the support desk. So that's kind of where we are now with the institution program. It's been growing in features and services. We are launching at the end of the year a new dashboard that only our institutional liaison person, the person at the library or the research office who works with us, for them to be able to log in and see metrics about what their users are doing in OSF, see the number of projects they've created, how many they've created in the last month, how much data they're storing on OSF, if they are using integrated storage add-ons that we work with. So if they're storing their material in OneDrive, or if they're storing it directly on OSF, how many registrations, preprints in which communities. We offer quarterly metrics reports right now that get into some high level of those things, but this dashboard that will be launched in probably the first of next year will be live and much more granular detail into all of that content. And I'm happy to answer any follow-up questions on that. If you're interested in OSF institutions, we do a monthly webinar about the institutional membership program, where you can find out a lot more information, and you can find out about those on the COS website under our tools and products. OSF institutions is listed there. Yeah, I see another question here. Side question, I'm a librarian. Where can I begin learning more about advising researchers who might have sensitive data and are deciding what de-identification steps to take and how to share? David, do you have recommendations on that?
Well, yeah, a couple of points. So there's some, I'm wondering if we have a help guide on it. I will have to do
Yeah, let me look. Why don't you talk? I'll look.
And there was our executive director, Brian Nosek, recently published on some issues with re-identifiability of data and some issues to take into consideration there. So we can, I can update the slides and put in a couple of links to those. I will say that all of the OSF projects and components are private by default. So when you first start it, it's all private, and it only becomes publicly available if you take the step to make that happen. So there is that built-in protection, but in general, sharing sensitive information needs an additional safeguard on that's the responsibility of the researcher and the training they take for IRB certification. So it's enabled on OSF, but it's the responsibility of the collecting party to make sure that that's followed properly.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any explicit guide right now about de-identifying. I don't know if any other COS staff are on the call and can fill that in, but it's a great question. And now you've made me think I need to add that to our help guides for librarians. So thank you for the suggestion.
Seeing no other questions, I think we will give everyone an appreciative thank you for participation, and we will see you another time.